The colonel laughed, a sharp, barking sound that echoed through the officers' club at Fort Braxton Military Base like a cannon blast, rattling crystal goblets on polished mahogany tables. He was laughing at a little black girl, 12 years old, alone, standing in front of a dozen senior officers in full uniform. "Are you serious, girl?" Colonel Marcus Steele leaned forward in his leather armchair, blue eyes gleaming with cold amusement. His voice was a low growl coated in mockery as he gazed at the child before him. Her posture ramrod straight, her chin lifted in quiet defiance, her tiny hands clenched at her sides as if holding back a storm. Draped around her neck was a yellowed envelope and a heavy medal, the Medal of Honor that had belonged to her father, the late Sergeant David Johnson. It glinted under the chandelier light, like a silent rebuke to the laughter surrounding her. Maya Johnson stood in her father's shadow, but she wasn't hiding in it. She was here because it was the 3rd anniversary of his death in combat, and she had come with a simple request to honor his memory by using the base's firing range. "Sir, I would like to request permission to use the shooting range today," she repeated, her voice calm, though the paper in her hand trembled ever so slightly. "It's how my father and I spent time together before he left for his final mission. He taught me everything he knew." Steele slammed his hand on the table, setting off a ripple of laughter so loud it shook the windows. "Did you hear that? The girl thinks she knows how to shoot," he roared. "What's next? She'll want to fly one of our fighter jets." Around him, the other officers chuckled, their laughter sharp and cruel like bayonets. "Children should be playing with dolls," muttered Major Thompson, his lips curling with disdain. "Little girls belong in school, not messing around with guns," sneered Captain Williams, fueling another round of derision. But what these men didn't know, what Maya carried like a locked vault in her soul, was that Sergeant David Johnson had been no ordinary soldier. For 6 years, while most kids were watching cartoons or playing games, Maya had been training beside her father. Every afternoon after school, every Saturday and Sunday without fail, he had sharpened her aim, steadied her hands, and taught her the discipline of a marksman. Not just any marksman. David Johnson had held the unofficial base record for sharpest shooting, a legend whispered in the barracks but never acknowledged by the brass. 3 years ago, standing at his flag-draped grave, Maya had made him a vow. No one heard it but her, a promise burned into her bones. She would make him proud. She would earn the respect he never got. Colonel Steele rose to his feet, his towering figure casting a long shadow across the room as he slowly circled the girl. His boots struck the floor with deliberate weight, like the beat of a war drum. "Listen here, girl," he said, voice dripping with mock sympathy. "This is no place for children to play soldier. Guns are not toys. Our shooting range is not a playground. Go home. Watch cartoons. Let the adults handle serious matters." Heat flooded Maya's cheeks, but she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She inhaled deeply, feeling the same chilling focus her father had taught her rise like mist in her chest. This wasn't pure anger. It was sharper, colder, forged through years of being doubted, mocked, ignored. "With all due respect, sir," she said, voice steady as steel wire, "I have the necessary documentation. My supervision is approved by the Military Family Affairs Department, and all security protocols have been met. My request is fully within base regulations." Major Peterson, seated beside Steele, nearly choked on his whiskey. "The little girl knows the rules." "How adorable," he coughed, and laughter erupted again. But something had shifted. Some of the officers were no longer quite so comfortable. The humor felt thinner now, more nervous than amused. And then Maya met Steele's gaze head-on. Her eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. And in that moment, something flickered across the colonel's expression, an almost imperceptible crack in his facade. It wasn't fear. Not yet. But it was the awareness that this child wasn't ordinary, that her composure was unnatural, too still, too calm, like the kind of calm soldiers remember from moments before a sniper's bullet finds its mark. The kind of calm that haunted war stories told over drinks and firelight. Steele scoffed with theatrical disdain, masking the unease that had wormed its way into his gut. "Stubborn little girl," he muttered. "Very well. Since you insist, let's do a little test." If you can hit at least 3 out of 10 targets at 50 meters, I'll personally sign your authorization. But when you fail, and you will, I want your word you'll stop pestering important men with these childish fantasies. A flame lit behind Maya's eyes. Not rage, not even pride, just that same silent promise she'd made to the grave 3 years ago. She nodded once. I accept your proposal, sir. And she stood there, firm and still, as if already holding a rifle in her hands instead of paperwork, as if she'd been preparing her whole life for this very moment. Because, in truth, she had. She wasn't just there to fire a few shots. She was there to transform humiliation into history, to prove that greatness wasn't bound by age, gender, or skin color, to make them remember her name. Steele's smirk widened like a shark who thought he was circling prey. Perfect, he said, with a clap of his hands. Let's all go witness a valuable lesson in knowing your place. He turned toward the door with smug confidence, gesturing dramatically to the other officers. Gentlemen, to the firing range. Major Thompson stood, cracking his knuckles with anticipation. This should be good, he chuckled. Let's see what the little doll can do with a real weapon. They had no idea that what awaited them was not just a girl with a gun, but the birth of a legend. This is going to be better than a movie, one of the officers chuckled as they strolled toward the firing range. The group's mood light with anticipation and cruel amusement. The little girl will run out crying before she can even hold a gun, sneered Captain Williams, prompting another wave of laughter that echoed down the corridor like a pack of hyenas on a fresh scent. Maya walked a few steps behind them, silent, her face unreadable. She heard every venom-laced comment. Not a single whisper lost her ears. I bet she'll faint at the first shot, Williams added under his breath, or start crying for her mommy. What none of them realized, what they could never have imagined, was that Maya Johnson had walked this very path hundreds of times before. For 3 long years, every Saturday at precisely 5:30 a.m., she had quietly slipped onto the base while it was still asleep, the morning fog clinging to the grass like breath on glass. An aging maintenance soldier, a war veteran who had once bled beside David Johnson, would silently unlock the gate for her. No words, no explanations, just a shared understanding between two people who honored the fallen not with speeches, but with action. As the group reached the firing range, Colonel Steele gestured dramatically toward a table lined with standard-issue firearms. "Pick your tool of humiliation, little girl," he said mockingly. "I recommend the lightest one. Maybe you'll manage to hold it without dropping it." Maya approached the table with unshaken calm, her fingers moving across the weapons until they stopped on a Glock 19 pistol, the same model her father had used to teach her to shoot when she was just 7 years old. Her fingertips brushed the grip, as if greeting an old friend. "Interesting choice," Steele drawled, pretending to sound impressed. "At least you got good taste in failing with style." The laughter returned, but it wasn't as unified as before. Some of the younger soldiers and a few seasoned ones watching from a distance didn't find it funny anymore. Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's shooting instructor and a man who had served under David Johnson during his most dangerous deployment, stepped forward with a wary look. "Colonel," he said, glancing at Maya with something like respect, "perhaps we should consider additional supervision for the minor." "Nonsense," Steele snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "The girl wants to play soldier. Let her learn like one. No clicks, no hand-holding." The dismissive cruelty in his tone made even a few of his own officers exchange uneasy glances. Maya picked up the Glock with steady hands and performed a weapons check so fluid and precise it caused Rodriguez to blink in disbelief. She ejected the magazine, checked the chamber, tested the trigger, all movements executed with the unconscious grace of someone who had repeated the ritual thousands of times. Steele watched with a smirk curling on his lips. Well, he murmured. "Looks like Daddy taught you a few basic tricks before he wasn't around to protect you anymore." The barb sank deep, but Maya gave no visible reaction. Her face was still, not frozen by fear, but steeled by focus. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them again, something in her had changed. The hesitant 12-year-old girl was gone. In her place stood a figure honed by fire, grief, and resolve. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. It unnerved even the most cynical officers watching. Ready when you are, Maya said, her voice carrying an icy clarity that silenced even the background murmurs. It was a tone Rodriguez had only ever heard on the battlefield, the voice of someone about to carry out the impossible. Colonel Steele folded his arms as the other officers leaned forward, murmuring bets under their breath. All right, little girl. 10 shots. Target at 50 meters. Hit at least 3, and I'll sign your precious authorization. Should be easy for someone with your family training. But what these smug, uniformed men didn't know was that David Johnson had not just been a skilled shooter. He had been the shooter. The man elite soldiers sought out in secret for help before critical missions. The one whose techniques saved lives in places the world never heard about. And Maya had inherited not just his lessons, but his obsession with mastery. Over the past 3 years, she had clocked 4,847 hours of training. Every Saturday morning, every holiday, every pocket of silence between her grief and her hunger to make her father proud. As Maya took her shooting position, the very air around her seemed to shift. The wind slowed, the trees hushed, the laughter faltered. Even Steele felt a subtle unease crawl down his spine, though he shook it off his nerves. Maya's presence no longer read as a child on a fool's errand. It read as something entirely different, focused, composed, almost predatory in its stillness. Each insult, each joke at her expense, had done the opposite of what they intended. They had not weakened her. They had forged her, fed her. And now, those same men were about to become footnotes in the story of their own humiliation. Rodriguez watched her settle into position with military precision, feet planted, spine aligned, breath measured. It was like watching a ghost in the past. He'd seen David Johnson take this exact stance years ago, before pulling off shots that stunned even seasoned snipers. What's the hold-up, little girl? Steele taunted from behind, trying to recapture the mood. Need help holding the gun? Want someone to point the target out to you. A few weak chuckles followed, but they sounded hollow now, forced. Maya ignored them all. She closed her eyes again, just like her father taught her. Take a deep breath, princess. Feel the wind. Listen to the silence between your heartbeats. The perfect shot happens in that moment of stillness. His words whispered in her soul like a sacred mantra. When she opened her eyes, everything around her seemed frozen. Soldiers who had just been passing by stopped in their tracks, drawn by the magnetic stillness in the girl on the firing line. Rodriguez took a slow step forward, his instincts kicking in. He knew what was about to happen. He had seen it before, in a war zone where seconds determined life or death. Maya's voice broke the silence. Ready when you give a signal, she said, not with arrogance, but with a certainty that made Steele blink. It wasn't a bluff. She wasn't hoping to succeed. She knew she would. Rodriguez stepped closer to Steele, lowering his voice. Colonel, maybe we should consider issuing proper hearing protection for everyone here. For safety. Steele scoffed, waving him off. It's 10 shots from a scared kid, Sergeant. We don't need full military protocol to watch a failure in the making. Rodriguez said nothing, but positioned himself at the edge of the firing line, alert, ready to intervene. Not because he feared for Maya's safety, but for what her precision might do to egos assembled around her. He had seen this before. David Johnson hadn't just trained killers. He trained ghosts, invisible, perfect shooters who moved through the world unnoticed until it was too late. And now, standing before them, was his legacy, wrapped in the body of a 12-year-old girl with fire in her soul and steel in her gaze. All right, little girl. Colonel Steele announced with theatrical flair, his tone laced with cruel amusement. You have 60 seconds for your 10 shots. Starting now. His voice echoed over the silent range like a gavel, expecting to mark the beginning of a farce. But what followed stunned everyone. Maya's first shot cracked across the field like precise thunder, dry, clean, deadly. Before the echo had even faded, the second shot followed with a rhythm that made several veterans on the sidelines instinctively straighten. It wasn't just fast, it was disciplined. It was the rhythm of someone who had fired thousands of times, someone who had internalized the art until it became muscle memory. Sergeant Rodriguez, observing through his binoculars, felt a chill crawl down his spine. He had been prepared to defend her effort. Instead, he whispered in awe, "My God, she's better than her father." Steele was still laughing as the third shot rang out, but the mirth in his voice faltered slightly. The precision of each shot didn't match his expectations for a public spectacle. It didn't feel like humiliation. It felt like something else. "At least she's quick," Major Thompson offered with a half-hearted smirk, trying to maintain the mood. Maybe she just wants to get the embarrassment over with. But they didn't know Maya Johnson. They didn't know the fire that burned behind her calm eyes. For the past 3 years, she hadn't merely practiced shooting. She had immersed herself in it with the dedication of someone on a sacred mission. For 1,095 consecutive mornings, she had risen at 5 a.m. and walked to the makeshift range behind her home, where paper targets taped to tree trunks bore silent witness to her promise. More than that, she had clocked 847 hours in mental training alone, refining focus, breath control, and a meditative awareness that allowed her to silence the world and exist entirely within a single shot. These were not just skills. They were a devotion. Shots 4, 5, and 6 came in quick succession, each one executed with mechanical precision that left murmurs rippling across the crowd. Even the officers who had been cackling earlier were now exchanging nervous glances. "It's taking too long to check the target," Captain Williams muttered, his voice betraying the first tremors of unease. No one moved to verify the hits. But Rodriguez already knew the truth. He had heard the sound, the unmistakable high-pitched metallic ping that only occurred when a bullet struck the exact center of a metal target. It was not a sound of failure. It was the sound of a legend in the making. Maya kept firing, her expression still and unwavering. Each pull of the trigger was timed with unshakable calm. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the silent execution of skill honed in solitude. When the 7th shot rang out, Steele stopped laughing entirely. The 8th turned whispered taunts into rigid silence. And the 9th shot sealed the moment. The field fell so quiet that even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself were watching. Then came the 10th and final shot. Maya paused before she fired, not in doubt, but in precision. She subtly adjusted her stance, shifting her weight to compensate for a small gust of wind that none of the others had noticed. It was instinctual, seamless, an adjustment made not from guesswork, but from years of experience and intuition. The final shot echoed out like a closing bell, and with it, the stillness became total. Maya lowered her weapon with measured grace, engaged the safety, and turned to face Steele. 10 shots complete as requested, sir," she said, her voice clear and formal, a young soldier standing at attention. For the first time that day, Colonel Steele looked truly uncertain. His eyes flicked between Maya and the distant target, as if trying to reconcile what he had just witnessed with what he still desperately wanted to believe. Rodriguez, silent, raised his high-powered binoculars again, preparing to confirm what many in the crowd already suspected but were too afraid to say aloud. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of the moment. He had seen great marksmen in his career. He had served alongside elite snipers. But this felt different, because what those smug officers didn't understand was that Maya hadn't come here to win a bet. She hadn't come to earn the reluctant respect of men who doubted her. She came to prove a legacy, to demonstrate that the strength some tried to erase grows louder in the silence of perseverance, that a child they mocked was more soldier than they'd ever be. Rodriguez adjusted the focus, and then his expression shifted, professional interest giving way to disbelief, then to something bordering on reverence. His face went pale. He kept staring. The silence stretched longer, heavier. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Steele called out, trying to mask the tremor in his voice with forced authority. "What's the result?" "I'm sure we can start preparing the reality check for our young friend." Rodriguez slowly lowered the binoculars. For a long moment, he didn't speak. His eyes locked with Maya's, a mix of awe and something almost like guilt in his expression. Then he turned to the colonel. "Colonel," he said, voice low and strained, "you need to see it for yourself." Steele's smirk twitched. "What do you mean, see it? How many did she hit? 5? 6? His tone was casual, but underneath it throbbed a note of rising panic. The confidence that had carried him into this moment was beginning to unravel. Rodriguez extended binoculars with a hand that trembled despite his best efforts to remain composed. "Sir, all 10. There," he broke off, shaking his head slightly, as if his own eyes had betrayed him. "You'd better check for yourself." Steele snatched binoculars with a sudden jerk, raising them to his face. His hands were no longer steady. When the target came into view, the smirk melted away, and his breath caught in his throat. All 10 shots. Dead center. Not even a millimeter off. The clustered pattern was so impossibly tight it looked fake, like someone had pasted a perfect group on the bullseye. But it was real. He knew it. And so did everyone else watching. The humiliation he had so meticulously orchestrated had collapsed into a stunning reversal, burying him under the weight of a child's silent triumph. What he saw through those lenses wasn't just accuracy, it was mastery. And it had come not from a soldier on the front lines of war, but from a 12-year-old girl who had refused to be dismissed. Maya Johnson had not just hit her targets. She had dismantled their arrogance with every pull of the trigger. All 10 shots hadn't merely struck the center of the target. They had formed a cluster so impossibly tight it looked like a single, slightly widened hole burned clean through the steel. It was a kind of precision that even elite snipers worked years to perfect. And yet here it was, executed effortlessly by a 12-year-old girl who stood with the calm of someone who had simply delivered on a quiet promise. "That's impossible," Colonel Steele muttered under his breath, his eyes glued to the target through his lens. He checked, then checked again. His grip on the binoculars tightened as the truth stared back at him, undeniable and absolute. It has to be some kind of trick. Faulty equipment. Something. But his voice had lost its sharp edge. It sounded less like defiance and more like a man grasping for explanations that didn't exist. Maya said nothing. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't meet his disbelief with defiance. Her expression remained dignified and composed. The same quiet strength she'd carried into firing range still etched across her young face. She had done what she came to do, and she had done it with the grace her father had taught her. Major Thompson stepped forward, snatching the binoculars from Steele's unsteady hands. One glance through the lenses, and he recoiled as if he'd been struck. "My God," he breathed, "that cluster's better than anything I've seen in 20 years of service." His voice carried the weight of stunned respect. One by one, the other officers followed, each taking a turn to look, each watching their arrogance dissolve into disbelief. Captain Williams, who had so confidently dismissed the idea of a little girl belonging on a firing line, stood pale and silent, all his bravado erased by the bulletproof truth on that distant target. It was in this moment of stunned silence that Sergeant Rodriguez made a decision, one that would echo far beyond the base that day. He stepped forward, his voice loud enough to carry across the assembled crowd. "Miss Johnson," he said, his tone lined with reverence, "your father would be the proudest man on the planet right now. What you just did doesn't just honor his memory. It sets a new standard of excellence for this entire base." The words struck Steele like bullets of truth. Suddenly, the full weight of the situation crystallized in his mind. He hadn't just mocked a grieving child. He had ridiculed the daughter of a decorated war hero, a child whose skill now publicly eclipsed that of many under his command. And he had done it in front of witnesses. Witnesses who were already whispering among themselves, some discreetly raising their phones to capture photos and video. The story would spread across the base by sunset and likely beyond. The colonel who laughed at a child and got humiliated by her extraordinary skill. How? Steele finally managed, his voice thin and foreign to his own ears. How can a child shoot like that? Maya turned to him, meeting his eyes for the first time since she'd stepped onto the range. Her voice was calm, her words simple and devastating. "My father taught me that respect is earned through actions, not words. And when someone doubts you based on prejudice, the best answer is to show them what you're truly capable of." The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was reverent. A 12-year-old girl had just delivered a lesson in dignity, discipline, and restraint to a crowd of senior officers who had spent their lives believing they already knew everything there was to know about those things. Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice lower but no less sincere. "Miss Johnson, your father once told me you had a natural gift. But he never explained it, never said you were. He paused, searching for the right word. Extraordinary. He looked at her with new eyes. Would you be interested in demonstrating your skills at longer distances? Maya's eyes lit up, not with arrogance, but with purpose. What distance do you have in mind, Sergeant? 100 meters? 200? Whatever you're comfortable with, he offered, now speaking with the respect owed to a master marksman, regardless of age. Steele stood frozen, watching the exchange in silent horror. He realized then that his humiliation was far from over. Maya Johnson hadn't come just to hit 10 targets. She had come to transform the very ground they stood on. Each breath she took, each word she spoke, was slowly unraveling the hierarchy of power he had taken for granted. More soldiers gathered, drawn to the range by rumors that now spread like wildfire through the base. They arrived in clusters, whispering, watching, trying to catch a glimpse of the girl who had made legends look like amateurs. Some veterans came forward, too, men who had seen real combat, who knew what real skill looked like, and every one of them carried an expression not of disbelief, but of respect. Maya moved with quiet confidence, checking her Glock with the same fluid professionalism that had stunned them earlier. Every action was deliberate, controlled, unshaken. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, her voice calm and clear, 200 meters would be a good next step. And in that moment, Steele saw it with blinding clarity. She hadn't come just to win a challenge. She had come to teach a lesson about skill, about humility, about the dangers of dismissing someone based on their age, their race, or their grief. A lesson no one on that range would ever forget. And it was only just beginning. As new targets were arranged at double the original distance, targets that challenged even seasoned professionals, a question loomed heavy in the air, pulsing like electricity. Would Maya continue to defy every limit they thought they knew? Or would this new distance finally expose the ceiling of her unbelievable ability? But perhaps the most pressing question of all was this. What else could these men possibly learn from a 12-year-old girl who had already redefined everything they believed about strength, discipline, and respect? The range was silent again. All eyes turned to Maya, and she raised her weapon once more. 6 months after the day that would forever be etched in the legacy of Fort Braxton, Maya Johnson walked the base corridors with a golden badge gleaming proudly from a lanyard around her neck. It read, Junior Precision Marksmanship Instructor, Army Exceptional Talent Program. At just 13, Maya had become the youngest person in American military history to receive such an honor, officially recognized not as a novelty, but as a legitimate authority in marksmanship. What had begun as a humiliating challenge designed to break her spirit had instead transformed into a global demonstration of brilliance. That fateful morning had turned into a legend. After flawlessly hitting targets at 200 meters, Maya kept going 300, 400, 500. Each distance brought gasps, not just because of her calm precision, but because she struck a coin-sized bullseye at 500 meters using iron sights alone. Combat veterans wept openly. Tough, stoic men who had seen war broke into tears as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Someone had discreetly filmed the entire demonstration. Within days, the video had gone viral across military forums, social media, and news outlets around the world. Titled Little Girl Humiliates Racist Colonel with Impossible Shot, it racked up 47 million views in just 2 weeks. Maya Johnson became a global symbol. Not just a talent, but of what could happen when prejudice is met with unstoppable excellence. For Colonel Marcus Steele, the consequences were as swift as they were brutal. A formal military investigation uncovered a disturbing pattern of discriminatory conduct stretching back years. Dozens of families came forward with their own stories, marginalized soldiers and dependents whom Steele had belittled, denied, or mocked. Images of him sneering at Maya circulated across military channels with captions like, "The man who underestimated a legend." He was formally demoted, stripped of command, and reassigned to a desolate base in Alaska, his duties reduced to clerical administration. His once proud retirement plan, filled with promises of ceremony and honors, ended in quiet disgrace. And perhaps most poetic of all, he now reported to superior officers who were black and Hispanic, officers who had heard every detail of the story that brought him down. Major Thompson, and Captain Williams didn't escape unscathed either. They received formal reprimands and were ordered into mandatory diversity and leadership reform training. Though allowed to remain in service, their reputations were permanently scarred. They were no longer seen as authority figures, but as cautionary examples. Meanwhile, Maya's star only continued to rise. The Pentagon, recognizing both her brilliance and the significance of what had transpired, created a tailored program allowing her to integrate standard school curriculum with advanced military education. Elite universities began contacting her family with scholarship offers years in advance. Defense companies reached out with offers to sponsor her development, eager to be associated with a legend in the making. But beyond the accolades, Maya's greatest impact was cultural. Letters poured in, thousands of them, from children across the country, particularly from underrepresented communities. Kids who had felt invisible or underestimated wrote to say they now believed in their dreams because of her. For Black girls especially, Maya Johnson became more than a role model. She became proof, living, breathing, bullseye landing proof, that no one could dictate your potential based on the color of your skin or the assumptions they made about your age, gender, or background. Rodriguez, promoted to staff sergeant for his integrity and mentorship during the incident, became Maya's official guide and trainer. He often watched with quiet awe as Maya instructed new recruits, young men and women twice her age who listened with the kind of respect usually reserved for seasoned generals. "Your father will be bursting with pride," he said to her one afternoon, watching her correct a recruit's posture with calm authority. "But I think he'd be even prouder of the woman of character you're becoming." The very range where it all begun, the site of Maya's public crucible and resurrection, was renamed the David Johnson Shooting Range in her father's honor. A bronze plaque mounted near the entrance told the story of that unforgettable day. Not the scandal, not the humiliation, but the triumph. A testament that excellence doesn't always arrive in the form people expect, and that sometimes it comes in the form of a girl with a steady hand, a fearless heart, and a promise to keep. Maya still visited her father's grave every Saturday. But now, she no longer knelt in tears. She came with stories, with updates, with smiles. She'd stand tall, brush off the leaves from his tombstone, and quietly recount her week. New training modules, newly inspired kids, new records shattered. And at the end, she'd always say the same thing, a soft whisper carried by the breeze. "I did it, Dad. I showed them what we're capable of." The base itself had transformed. Policies changed. A new zero-tolerance stance on discrimination was implemented. New outreach programs were developed to identify and foster talent from underserved communities. Maya's story became required reading in leadership seminars and military ethics courses. She had become a living parable, one that taught not just the value of excellence, but the danger of arrogance and the power of resilience. Perhaps the deepest irony of all was that Colonel Steele, in his attempt to shame and silence Maya, had inadvertently handed her the very spotlight that would light her path to greatness. His effort to diminish her had become the launch pad of her legend. The ridicule he crafted with such cruelty had become the most inspiring origin story of a generation. He had tried to bury her, but all he did was plant a seed. In a televised interview 6 months later, Maya was asked the inevitable question: did she hold a grudge against Colonel Steele? Her answer stunned the nation and silenced the interviewer. "He gave me the greatest gift possible," she said without bitterness. "The opportunity to prove him wrong." Sometimes our greatest opponents become our best teachers, even if they don't mean to be. And in that single sentence, Maya Johnson revealed what made her truly extraordinary. Not just her aim, not just her discipline, but her heart. She had turned humiliation into motivation, prejudice into jet fuel, and underestimation into unstoppable momentum. The little girl who once stood trembling in front of a room full of dismissive officers had become a symbol of something greater than any medal or badge could represent. She had rewritten the rules about race, gender, age, and expectation, about grief, about greatness, and about the infinite, explosive power of refusing to be small just because someone else can't see how big you are. If the story of unshakable determination and poetic justice moved you, if it reminded you that sometimes the smallest figures carry the largest legends, then subscribe to our channel. Because Maya Johnson's story is just one of many. And here we share the truth that some of life's greatest humiliations can become its most legendary victories.